Welcome to class for this week. This week I am at the NIH. I know I've been gone a lot, and I apologize for that. This summer was fairly well booked before I agreed to help teach the class, and so this week I'm at the NIH doing grant reviews for them. And I know Amanda, we had scheduled a vacation, so that before we agreed to do the class. So this week you're going to listen to lectures via video. Um, this week isn't as challenging as last week is, and I don't want you to take your foot off the pedal because there's some very important topics here. There's probably 5 to 8 test questions on the ACS that'll be come directly from this chapter, or this week, and so. But it's nowhere near as challenging because last week we had a bunch of math to worry about, and as well as content. This week is all content. And it's some of the more interesting content in my book because you're going to actually see this is disease state stuff 101. You're going to see this. This biochemistry is some of the most important that you're going to face. And that directly relates to the case study that we're going to talk about right now, where we have 3 patients. Sylvia, a white woman, 43, who has a history of obesity with little success in dieting over the years. Her triglyceride levels are 178. Milligrams per deciliter. Gertrude is 55, who has a 30-year history of smoking 1 pack a day. Her HDL is only 35 and her LDL is 145. She takes gemfibrozil as prescribed by her physician, but she's an active smoker. Viviana is 47. Family history of heart disease, 30 pounds overweight. No exercise, drinks 2 to 3 glasses of red wine daily, but has never smoked. Which patient has the greatest risk of heart disease? And if you're in class, I'd spend some time talking about this. We're going to tie this back in at the end of lecture, and I want you to think about these factors as we go through this entire lecture. Normally, we've been trying to do antibiotics, and I thought about trying to convolute antibiotics into lipids, but I think this topic right now is really important from the perspective that lipids will be a major source of, and heart disease will be a major source of, and diabetes, all related to lipids, will be a major source of what you will see from your patients going forward. Crazy part is 1 in 3 deaths in the United States is preventable and is caused by, or 1 in 3 deaths in the United States is caused by heart disease and stroke. 200,000 deaths from heart disease and stroke are preventable. And so that's 200,000 people who lose their life every year, completely preventable. Some of the risk factors, again, nearly 800,000 people die every year from heart disease and stroke, high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, tobacco use, unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, and obesity. And you notice that most of those are controllable. And so with diet and exercise. So how does this all relate? We're going to talk about lipids today, and lipids are hydrophobic or amphiphilic small molecule, meaning that generally they fall into long chain hydrocarbons, although there are several unique features about lipids that when you sort out biomolecules are important. So ketoacyls, including acetyl and isoprene groups, are important in actually defining them. So there's 2 distinct chemical subunits. If you wanted to precisely define lipids, it would be this ketoacyl and isoprene groups, and that includes everything from hormones. If you look at this, they include fatty acids, triacylglycerols, sphingolipids, phosphoacylglycerols, glycolipids, lipid-soluble vitamins, prostaglandins, leukotrienes, thromboxanes, cholesterol, steroid hormones, and bile acids. All of these are included in this. Today we're going to talk about storage lipids. Next lecture we'll talk about structural lipids, and then we'll talk about hormones, all 3 in a very short period of time. All of these are classified as lipids. So the biological functions of lipids are pretty diverse, and there's 2 primary ones: the storage of energy, which you're probably all familiar with. In fact, that's the famous story. The other one is the membrane, the importance of membranes. But they also have several important other functions, including insulation from the environment. They provide mechanical protection. in that they can absorb shocks, energy from or blows. They also provide water repellency because they're very, very hydrophobic. They also provide pigments in the form in things such as tomatoes, carrots, etc. They're antioxidants. They increase your buoyancy. There's a lot of control for uh, helping diving. Membrane structures, obviously, as we mentioned. Cofactors for enzymes, things like CoQ10 and vitamin K are lipids that are important in enzymatic function. We have signaling molecules, hormones. This is just the third lecture in the lipid discussion. So those are all the functions of lipids. Uh, they in this lecture, we're going to talk about fats and fatty acids and lipids as providing efficient fuel storage. The advantage of fats over polysaccharides is that they carry more energy per carbon, and they carry less water per gram because they're very nonpolar. So they're very efficient storage mechanisms. Those 2 points are very, very important for you to know and remember. Glucose and glycogen are very short-term energy needs for quick delivery. Fats are for long-term, over months, and they have good storage and they are slow in delivery. So one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about classification of lipids, and in particular, this is for fatty acids more than it is almost anything else because there's a very little discussion of hormones. We're going to talk about on the left side, which are storage lipids, which are very neutral, and they're focused on triacylglycerols or triglycerides. That's going to be the focus of this lecture. The next lecture, we'll talk about all the membrane lipids or structural lipids, and there's quite a few of those for various and different things. But here we're going to talk about glycerol with triacylglycerols with the glycerol backbone and how those interact and store. Okay, so we're going to talk right now about fatty acid nomenclature, and this is going to be an important part of your ACS exam. It will be one question, I promise you. There'll be one question on fatty acid nomenclature on that exam, so you'll want to know this. There's 2 conventional ways of naming fatty acids. We could start with the alpha carbon, which is the carboxyl group you can see on the left, and we can number 1 through 18. We start at the that's not actually, it's the number 2 carbon is actually the alpha carbon in this scenario, but we number out that way. The other way is you can start at the omega end, and in that end, on the other end of the carboxyl, and you'll find that when we name omega 3s and omega 6s and omega 9s. So you can see that this is an omega 3. On the top, A is an omega 9. That's one convention for naming. The other convention, we end up this is the part that will be on the exam, is this is an 18 carbon fatty acid. We number all the carbons out, we count them all out. That's what the 18 is. The 1, okay, tells you how many double bonds there are. And the delta 9 tells you where those double bonds are. So you can see 18-1, there's 1 double bond, and that's at delta 9. And it's a cis, meaning that if you look at that number 9 carbon, it's on a cis conformational, not a trans. Cis and trans, we're bringing back organic chemistry, and we'll talk about why cis and trans is important in a little bit, but this is a cis 9 octadecanoic acid, and the acid naming of the acid isn't important because you will not have to memorize that. You do need to be able to identify the numbers, how long the fatty acid chain is, how many double bonds there are, and the delta location of those double bonds. That's the important part, and whether it's cis or trans. So that's what you'll need to know. B, you have a 20 length. That's the 20. You have 20 carbons. That's a 20 colon 5. There are 5 double bonds. The delta with all of the locations of those double bonds, and this is EPA, and this is an omega 3. So you now know that you have to know that there's a double bond on the 3rd position on the omega end. That makes it an omega 3 fatty acid. So that's the naming convention that is going to be important in this. And when you do the exam, you'll need to know how to name these fatty acids. So the other aspect of fatty acid nomenclature that we're going to discuss right now is when these fatty acid chains are actually part of the glycerol molecule. So glycerol is the common backbone for fatty acids, storage fatty acids. It's a 3-chain carbon that has 3 hydroxyl groups. Those 3 hydroxyl groups are involved in an ester bond. with the backbone. It's an esterification, and you'll notice that when we name this, there's a chiral center in this molecule around the C2 molecule, around the C2 carbon, and that's where we start naming. And this is a mixed triacylglycerol here, where we have 3 different types of fatty acid chains that are attached at different locations on the C1, 2, and 3 each of those molecules. That's how we name it. So the naming will go off of whatever is attached to those fatty acid chains. This is the structure. So carboxylic acid, that's the head group on the hydrocarbon chains. Usually these carbons can be between 4 and 36 carbon. Almost all natural fatty acids have an even number of carbons, and that's due to fatty acid synthesis adding these molecules 2 at a time. They also come off 2 at a time, and so and when we are going to process them metabolically, most fatty acids are unbranched, meaning when we talk about carbohydrates, you'll notice that some of the carbohydrates are branched at certain locations, meaning we have 2 covalent bonds at one location, or 3 actually covalent bonds in a chain. Most natural fatty acids only are unbranched. Saturated, these are terms you're also going to want to know. Saturated means there are no double bonds between carbons in a chain. Monounsaturated means there's 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated means there's more than 1 double bond in the fatty acid chain. So, conformation of a fatty acid. A couple of important things. The packing of fatty acids is because these things are very long and they're relatively straight. So we can pack a lot of these into a very small amount of space. If we have an unsaturated, meaning we have a double bond in there, you'll notice that there's a kink. This is a cis conformation, meaning it's on the same side, right? If it was on the trans side, it's a little less packed. And so these saturated bonds versus unsaturated bonds have a little more space in there. Saturated bonds have a lot more opportunity to form hydrogen bonds between the fatty acid chains. And so, and cis and trans are also affect that ability of those molecules to form hydrogen bonds. And that's a steric issue. So in this situation, you can clearly see that this is a cis, as the molecules are on the same side. If they were trans, it would be the other way. And all bonds are free. All the other bonds in this are free to rotate, with the exception of that carbon-carbon double bond. And that allows a lot of flexibility and rotational ability and the ability to find hydrogen bonds. So how does this work? This gives a little bit better graphic representation of how saturated versus monounsaturated versus trans go. And a lot of partially dehydrogenated unsaturated fatty acids are manufactured because of their shelf life. The problem is that process of dehydrogenation makes them trans fat, and that causes all kinds of problems. So there's 2 things in lipids that are very, very problematic as far as health go: omega-6 versus the omega-3 versus omega-6 ratio. You want a high omega-3 ratio versus omega-6 ratio. Our Western diets, by feeding things a lot of corn and high fructose corn syrup, is very inflammatory. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is the other one. Trans fat cause all kinds of problems as far as health go, and so they're a big problem. Triacylglycerols, also called triglycerides, are majority of the fatty acids in our biological system, and they're formed in 2 forms: fats and oils. Solids are fats, oils are liquid. And that's an important distinction you're going to want to pay attention to as you get going, especially on tests. It's a great way for them to trip you up as far as definition goes. A solid has a lot more hydrogen bonds that are formed at a lower melting temperature. Liquids have obviously a higher melting temperature, and there's probably a little more saturated or unsaturated bonds in there, and so they are less likely to form hydrogen bonds because of that saturation, because of that kink, and that will increase the melting temperature. This is the triacylglycerols are primary storage of lipids, thus energy. They're also less soluble in water than fatty acids because of the charged carboxylate group, and anyway, so they're less dense in water, and so they have the distinction between fats and oils. So triacylglycerides again are formed, and this is a representation where you can the The triglyceride or glycerol is in the middle. We have 3 of those, and then they're linked in with various esterification bonds. They're pretty readily available. So right here we have our, if I can get the pointer to work. So right through we have our ester bonds, and we can link anything that any fatty acid chain can be linked up with this triglyceride. I apologize, I can't seem to get the laser pointer and the marker to work, but right through you can see that there are 3 esterification bonds that exist, and the physical properties of these triacylglycerol depends on the fatty acid chains that you have, and the melting point depends on the number of carbons. As the number of carbons in those fatty acid chains increase, the number of double bonds also affects the melting point, and that impacts any number of things, also the membrane fluidity, amongst other things, and provides biologically relevant functional differences between these triglycerides, which we'll talk about more. An important process that's associated with fatty acids, in particular with triacylglycerols, is saponification. Saponification is making of soap. You're going to want to know that because that pops up quite frequently, especially in these exams. And basically what you do is you take lye, which is sodium hydroxide, and you mix it with a triglyceride or triacylglycerol, and you end up with the process of a sodium soap and basically glycerin. And so that's an important process that you'll want to know how this works. It's saponification. Another important lipid is cholesterol. And you see this is a small molecule, cholesterol is. When we reference it, we're not talking about cholesterol, this cholesterol. When we reference cholesterol, we're talking about the fatty acid, we're talking about something else. We'll talk about here in a minute. Cholesterol is a small molecule. It's a hormone. It's a key regulator in membrane fluidity. It inserts itself into bilayers perpendicular to the membrane plane, and the hydroxyl groups form hydrogen bonds with the carbonyl oxygen of phospholipid head groups in triacylglycerols. And while the hydrocarbon tail then can position itself in between nonpolar core of the bilayer and hydrogen bond. And this will also form lipid rafts where certain complexes of phospholipids engage. And so it allows the membrane to become more or less fluid based on how much cholesterol is in there. It also increases the permeability of the cell. And that allows ions to get in and change. That's why sodium intake is important with cholesterol. Cholesterol, again, this is the small molecule. When we talk about cholesterol in the general public, we're talking about something else, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Cholesterol is also important as a precursor to steroid hormones, and we'll talk about that in one of the next lectures. So progesterone cholesterol is converted into progesterone and then to all other sex hormones, as well as some of the stress hormones you'll see. So you'll see it'll convert into testosterone and estradiol, as well as things like cortisol and aldosterone and cortisone. So cholesterol is one of the important precursors to a lot of different hormones. When we talk about cholesterol, generally in the free press, we're talking about LDLs. This is a low-density lipoprotein. I'll give you the full scoop on that in a minute, but the important part is that cholesterol small molecule, which you can see here in green, fits into a phospholipid head with tails that stick down. And you can see that those hydrophobic tails are sitting on the inside, and this membrane is full of proteins, cholesterols, and the polar head groups. And in the inside are hydrophobic tails and the very non-polar molecules. So this is a low-density lipoprotein, which is actually quite large. When we talk about these things, generally we're talking about HDL being good, which is a very small version of that LDL that you saw earlier with a lot more proteins in it and other factors. We start and the HDL is good good cholesterol, so to speak. When we start getting into LDLs, IDLs, VLDLs, and chylomicrons, those are very large cholesterol molecules or cholesterol. I use the term cholesterol loosely because they're not really cholesterol per se. It's a very much a fatty acid conglomeration that gets to be very, very large. And so those fatty acids, those long chain, have a lot of impact. What you see uh, is a LDL or HDL goes into the liver, and then in the liver we pack in all of the rest of the fatty acids. They go out and they go to cells. They can be used as VLDLs and IDLs to deliver energy to the muscles, etc. Once that muscle is used up, it goes back as a HDL or an LDL back to the liver. The liver adds back in all of the fatty acids, and then it comes back into the world to deliver those fat chain, i.e. energy, into a cell. So that's the life cycle. And the LGL stays in the plasma for about 2.5 days, and then basically it's going to take all of that energy it takes into the cells, and it's going to liberate the free cholesterol in at that point. So that's the life cycle of cholesterol carrying lipoproteins. What can happen, and this is kind of a malignancy state, is good HDL. Normally you have a little bit of bad cholesterol circulating at a good level or at a normal level. That's used up as energy in the cells. Good cholesterol is actually circulating back to the liver to be processed. What can happen is if you have too much of the bad cholesterol, LDLs, IDLs, VLDLs, chylomicrons, they'll form plaques and they'll start to aggregate on the side of blood vessels, and that's when you start getting plaques and blockages and weak spots where you can have ruptures, and so that's why your cholesterol level is very important. HDL is good. High levels of HDL is good. Low levels of HDL are bad, and high levels of LDL are bad. So what treatments exist to treat high cholesterol? What treatments? And there are lots of them because this is a big problem in the US. So, and some of the first one is diet and exercise. You do not want to be diet, in particular diet, and trans fats and some of these other fatty things are, incredibly bad for you. They also have high omega-3s or omega-6, and your omega-6 ratio is probably 20 to 1, 20 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3s. You want to have a 2 to 3 omega-6 because omega-3 is an anti-inflammatory, has an anti-inflammatory effect in your body, and that's one of the important things that working on your cholesterol serves. So the other thing is most cholesterol is carried by LDL, and a normal plasma levels are 175 milligrams per milliliter. And if there are sufficient LDL receptors on the surface, LDL is removed from circulation, and its concentration drops. And interestingly, PCSK9, which is a drug that I work on quite a bit, cleaves off the receptor, and the LDL is not brought into the cell. So the number of LDL receptors is controlled by a feedback mechanism surrounded by a serine protease called PCSK9. Again, it's important to regulate your levels of LDL in your blood. If you have high levels of cholesterol, high levels of LDL, you can have premature atherosclerosis and heart attacks or stroke. And so high LDLs with low HDLs is a very problematic. Your ratio is very, very important. And so there's a lot of drugs, including statins, that will try to control that. Again, diet and exercise, 50% reduction in trans fat will help reduction in sodium consumption, stop smoking, cholesterol management, blood control, blood pressure control, and aspirin, which thins the blood, all can impact it. If we're talking about, so let's go back to our topic, which is Gertrude actually has the worst problem because of her smoking and her age. Though that's probably the number one factor associated with this. She has her numbers are poor, and her smoking. And you can see that in this chart. Her numbers, she has 35 on her HDL, and she's high on her LDLs. And then you can see the numbers for triglyceride. When you get to be at 40, becomes a big problem for you. I've spent a lot of time trying to reduce my HDL, and LDL isn't bad. My triglycerides are really high. They were about 200, which is borderline high, and I've had to bring it back down. And because of diet, I'm down to 145, which is great. So what are some of the drug treatments? Statins. This is Lipitor. You've probably seen these ads all day long, and they remove the cholesterol from your blood. You have bile acid binding resins, things like Prevolite, Colestid, Welchol. Those are important bile acid. You also have cholesterol absorbing inhibitors, Zetia, some of these other, they're commonly used with statin drugs. One of the newer medications are Praluent and Repatha, which are LDL, which are PCSK9 drug targets and PCSK9 inhibitors. And I have friends who worked on these drug classes on both on some that made it, including Repatha, Regeneron. I have friends at Regeneron who worked on this. I also have people who worked on the other side and they didn't make it. So I have a friend, Yasmina, who worked at Pfizer when she was developing a drug for PCSK9, which are injectable medications or antibody-based drugs, who the clinical trial was cut short in phase 3. We also have fibrates. I take niacin, which is not an over-the-counter drug, but it's just it helps reduce the triglyceride levels. The other important one that I cannot emphasize enough is omega-3 fatty acid supplements. I take fish oil every day, and it's counterintuitive to take fish oil to decrease your triglycerides, but omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and that significantly decreases your triglyceride level. So those are the treatments you can have and use. Again, if you don't, right? If you have normal LDL levels, you can have a little bit of damage. It's fine. You get into disease development, and that's where plaques start to form, and you start getting high. And then there's at the top, you can see what the biomarkers are that start going up. So you can start getting troponin damage, CKMB damage. Those are some of the things. You start getting plaque formations and blood clot formations, and you're going to start getting damage. And that's a big deal. That's when you start seeing disease states and death. Again, some of the things 1 in 3 deaths is preventable with this. So healthcare costs for heart attack and stroke are $313 billion. It's the leading cause of preventable death. Again, heart attacks and strokes, you have 2.2 million plus a year. 800,000 people die. 1 million heart attacks and strokes are preventable. Take this back to where we started. We're talking about storage lipids. We're talking about all the acids, or all the fatty acids on the left. We have a glycerol head, 3 fatty acid attachment through an esterification, and the fatty acids can be of any different kind. So you have, again, a glycerol head group, 2 or 3 different fatty acid components are favorite, generally 3 in triglycerides. They're very hydrophobic, and they also form hydrogen bonds amongst themselves, and that's where you get the membrane characteristic. We'll talk about that when we start talking about structural lipids in the next couple of days. The ester groups, although they're polar, are pretty buried within a nonpolar environment, which makes triglycerides pretty insoluble in water. Again, one of the reasons why they form membranes. They're all practically unbranched. They range in size between 10 and 20 carbons practically. They generally have an even number of carbons, and aside from the carboxyl ester groups, aside from the ester groups, triglycerides have no functional groups. So they're all straight chain hydrocarbons. You do occasionally see a double bond. Again, that's the saturated versus unsaturated fat. And in most fatty acids, the carbon-carbon double bond is in the cis conformation. That's a good thing. If it's in the trans is when you have problems. With that, I will end the storage lipid discussion. Important points to remember are the functional description, including the triglycerides and also nomenclature. And we'll talk more about fatty acid metabolism as we get into some of the later lectures. With that, I will end and look forward to hearing and chatting with you and discussing the next topic, which is going to be structural lipids.